great game design is often, and great interactive design is not just about telling you a really cool thing or giving you a good option and a stupid option. It's about creating a compelling decision moment for you. Games are stories you live, not stories you're told.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Craft Podcast. Today, our guest is Dan Felder, and I will let you, Dan, introduce yourself and what you do.
Sure. I'm currently a game designer at Riot Games, previously Electronic Arts, Blizzard Entertainment, some fun indie studios. I've been in the game industry for a good number of years now, and I've been lucky enough to work with both small teams with really big hearts on just really great passion projects and just gigantic teams, leading huge amounts of content pipeline and designing feature. I've done a lot of stuff, mostly in strategy games, but I've love and study pretty much almost every genre. And I've done consulting in a lot too. So it's really fun to be on the podcast.
Thank you. And because I used to work at Riot, I'm wearing my Riot hoodie in honor of this episode. And the context for why I reached out to you in particular, because there's lots of game designers in the world, is I don't know how many platforms you're active on, but at least on LinkedIn, I've been reading a lot of your posts, and I frankly I love them because I think not just you, but it seems like video game designers have taken on the mantle of trying to kind of guard against the excesses of Web3 games, NFT play to earn. And I think it's awesome because I think the non-game designers, they like the hype, right? And I think it's easy to just jump into it and think it's the most perfect thing in the world. And it's obvious that we should do it. But I think it's going to be a balance, and I see some good parts of it, and there's lots of bad parts of it too today, and maybe in the future that'll change. So I want to dig into that a bit. But first of all, game design is it's a hot industry right now, especially driven by NFTs and Web3 games and the need for people who can design economies, systems, and whatnot. So the first question I have for you is, what are the kind of major, we'll call sub-functions within game design? When I look at job descriptions, I see things like, I want to hire a level designer, a system designer. What's the range of design in game design?
Endless. The thing about game design is one of my former bosses, who is just fantastic, had this great phrase, which is that game design is the last bastion of the Renaissance man. The idea that you need to understand science, math, art, you have to blend the whole of human knowledge and discipline together. In fact, a few years ago, when I was asking, as I always do, what can I be doing to my manager for personal development, he basically said, look, your game design skills are really, really good. Just start studying other disciplines, get better at get intro level and associate level in every discipline you work with. So that's what I've been really looking to do within engineering, within art, within product management, within production, and just trying to be somebody who can sit at the nexus of these disciplines and sort of carry one from to the other. So within a given team, how you break out those design responsibilities is immensely flexible. Because it's really about what you're responsible for, not so much what you have to know. So basically, if we're looking at card games, usually there's teams that break things down into people that come up with ideas for the cards, the people who focus on making sure that all of those individual ideas work together into a really good holistic format. And then usually people who focus on specializing on the art for the cards, and the theme and the writing, and all those narrative, theme, world building, lore designers on one hand, balance and metagame testers, and competitive designers, and then like initial creative designers, that's a very specific breakout for a very specific industry. Nothing like that in MMO. Like you're going to be focusing on people whose job it is to create the worlds and the levels, and you get like titles like world designer or environment designer. You look at Hollow Knight, you're going to be talking about 2D platformers. You'll be talking about people who design bosses, not just like the only thing they do. Hollow Knight's like 3 people, but like in a larger team, you might have people who just focus on just building great boss fights, and people who focus just on building like 2D levels, people who just focus on building tutorials. So we can break down in innumerable ways. One of my favorite websites posts that I've ever seen is this great thing called The Door Problem by Liz England. It's like the best post I've ever seen on this, which basically says, what the heck's the job of a game designer? And it gives an example of saying, all right, let's say we have doors in our game. How big are the doors? How do we open the doors? Should the doors make a nice sound when they open? How often should we be able to open the doors? Like, can 2 people go through the doors together? And it's like all these little questions about doors. And it's like, are all doors openable? If not, how will a player tell which doors are openable and which are not? And so there's all these little things that someone's got to answer those questions. That person's a game designer. And then it also in the bottom of the article goes through like every other team discipline and how they relate to doors, from like the character artist who's like, I don't care about doors until we can start wearing hats, to like the economy designers are saying like, I figured out that door should take like one small silver key to open most doors and a gold key to open these other doors, and you get keys at this rate. And that's often gets into economy and system design. But if I was going to break down the 2 large buckets, there's kind of system design and there's content design. There are people that create the rules of the game, like what are the ultimate systems that interact? If we're doing combat, how does that work? And if we're doing like if you're building a board game, what are the rules of the game? Like the rules of Monopoly. You roll 2 dice, not 3. You go that many spaces. You roll again on doubles. If you roll doubles 3 times, you go to jail. That's all system design. Content and system design will say, when you land on the square, you draw a chance card. Content designer says, great, I have 60 ideas for chance cards. And that's sort of the fundamental basics. The guys who have to think about the systems and how it all fits together, or sometimes that looks like feature design in live service, where you're building just like a new mode or something. Some people break it down to mode design. But then people who come up with the frameworks, and then people who fill it with IDs. Those are the 2 largest breakdowns. System designers are usually very analytical and have really strong tools to think about complex systems like blueprints, like architects in their head. And then content designers more like interior designers who basically make a room beautiful once it's been built for them. And they're often, they can be very analytical too, but often people who like are very self-taught and intuitive thrive in those environments, because they can kind of look at something and realize that it's cool and then go from there. It's very hard to intuit your way to system design because you're dealing with things you'll never be able to see the whole of. Sometimes you're dealing with something projected out 10,000 hours, and you have to be able to have tools for that.
I think that's a good article. I just pulled it up, and we'll add it to the show notes. It's funny because the 2 websites I have open, the 2 pages I have open, one is like the door problem, and the second one is I was doing some research on VR games earlier this morning, and I found this other article called "To Teleport or Not to Teleport: Teleporting versus Walking in a Metaverse." And it's just like, wow, like I started digging into it because I was meeting with another team about kind of figuring out like how can we like port 2D games to 3D, and then it just became this giant discussion like locomotion as like one aspect. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even think about that. And also on the previous episode of this podcast, we had just like a product designer, and she said the reason why I found this door example interesting because she talked about a chair. She says when you look at a chair, like, forget about like games, just look at everything in life is designed poorly or or well or neutral. And she was saying, you don't want to think about how a chair is made. You just want it to like work. And like, there's so many aspects of it. There's like so many chairs in the world. Like, think about it. It's kind of crazy the different variants of chairs there are even. So I think, which is interesting because this leads to my next question, which is like, how does one even learn about this? Because this Renaissance man concept, I really like it. Because when I worked at different game studios, it was interesting that, like a majority, but not all game designers have some coding skills or scripting skills. They somehow even know some things about art, and they just like know everything, but you know, but even like to become a Renaissance man, I feel like you have to start from somewhere.
Yeah.
To generally speaking, not everyone has the same career path, but like how does one start in this craft?
Really depends. Like, I like to tell people to play to their strengths. Like, for example, I do not have a very strong computer science skills compared to some people. And I really learned and iterated a lot through board game design, card game design, modding, level design tools, things like that. And that was a really good way to quickly iterate. The main thing you want to do is you want to put a lot of reps in, but you want to be reps of enlightened iteration. So the most useful thing to do is not just to make things, but it's to want to test hypotheses of very small games. Like when I was in college, the way that I did, I recommend this kind of for anyone who wants to get better as a game designer, is you do a lot of cognitive science research. You look at behavioral psychology, behavioral economics. You look at just any sort of research about anything in UX is really good, but also anything that's like behavioral economics is really good. The idea of how do humans do a thing? Game designers are fundamentally media designers who get to use all the tools available to them, which is one reason I got so interested in it. And basically, we're trying to create a chemical reaction in someone's brain. That's how brains experience emotion. So you want people to create, exultant joy or delight, or a sense of epic accomplishment, or an emotional connection. Moments of deep sorrow, if you're doing like an emotional story game, potentially contrasted with moments of exultant joy. And the best way to look at that is say, well, what's the research about human motivation, about human emotion? How do you cause that? There's a lot of research into that, and it's cognitive science is the way that it usually gets summarized. So people have been trying to figure out how to get people motivated for a long time. You can read Drive, Daniel Pink. You can read Predictably Irrational. You can read Switch by the Heath brothers. You can read Decisive by the Heath brothers. They're just great. Chip Heath and Dan Heath. Almost all the work they do is wonderful. Deeply Practical. Celia Hodent's book, The Gamer's Brain. But learn the principles about how humans parse decisions and how they emotionally feel things and why our brains work the way they do. And that gives you a lot of really useful tools. Then you build games around them. So like you start building a board game is the best way to do it because it teaches you system design and content design, and you can change the rules so quickly. Like an iteration for a board game is, okay, the rules are this now, let's try it. Versus in a game that might take months to code video game wise. So a lot of video game studios use paper prototyping for that reason. They try to simulate as much as possible in a spreadsheet or just on paper cards, even though it's going to be a video game eventually. Board gamer designers just get to do it straight up. Really, really good way to practice game design skills. Like have a hypothesis about how to make an existing board game you like better, or make a new one from scratch. Test it out as quickly as possible within a week. Learn why you're wrong. Then keep doing it until you're right more often than you're wrong.
So I think you mentioned the word media design in your last kind of way in what you just said. And I noticed that you went to school and you have a degree in game and interactive media design.
Yes.
I always look like very carefully at words, right? Like, why was the word interactive media added to this instead of just like game design? Like, why is that important?
Don't know. Well, so my major was a little bit weird in that they, at the time, they knew they wanted to do more exciting stuff like new media. At the time, it was called new media. Then it got changed like really late in my major to be like what it is now, I believe. But basically, like the core idea about media design is game design is so flexible. There are so many different types of games. People often argue over what a game even is. Not many people argue what a movie is. People argue what a game is. Not a useful conversation, by the way. If you can change the definition and it doesn't change the work, it's not very helpful. So basically, you got walking simulators on the one hand and you got RTSs on the other, and it's totally different. You got visual novels, doesn't matter. The key principle that makes game design really hard for people from just experts with disciplines to go into is the component of interaction. So that's very useful. A lot of game design can benefit from tools of classic, playwriting. I have a playwriting background, from classic ideas of visual design and photography. I've gotten a lot of value of composition from some photography classes I took in college. But what all of those mediums classically run into trouble when they try to jump to game design, it's what game writers often run into trouble when they come from with no game design or narrative design background. It goes straight from Hollywood to like making games, many of which, by the way, are utterly brilliant writers. But a challenge they often run into is trying to make room for the player. Like, the player isn't here to be told a story. They're here to live a story. Games are stories you live, not stories you're told. Throughout like human history, we have this deep primal need to listen to stories of adventure and excitement. It's a drive in us to hear about how other people survived extraordinary things or went off and found incredible, discoveries. And that's useful because it makes us share knowledge with each other. And so we have a drive for it. For the longest time in history, we told each other, well, I can't give you an amazing adventure, but I can tell you about Luke Skywalker or Odysseus and let you empathize with them and live vicariously through them. Game designers just say, hey, you want an adventure? Awesome, play Elden Ring. So basically, great game design is often, and great interactive design is not just about telling you a really cool thing or giving you a good option and a stupid option. It's about creating a compelling decision moment for you. One of my favorite examples of this is in the Mass Effect franchise. In the first game, spoiler alert for a game many years old, basically in the first game, Mass Effect, there is this moment where after a lot of buildup about this alien race that nearly killed everybody, and it sort of created the backdrop of the current conflict. And they're just always talked about like, dealing with them is the reason we have all these problems now and all these fractional wars. You don't expect them to show up again, but they do. And suddenly they've overrun this facility. And so I knew going in, because someone had told me that you would get a choice about whether to exterminate them forever or not. And I was going in thinking, this galaxy has enough problems. We're just gonna wipe this out. Let's be practical here. We're already nearly gonna get facing extinction. We don't need two problems. And I go start fighting them, and brilliantly, the first time in the game, they've changed level design to be horror style. They're using a lot of tricks from Resident Evil with having ambushes and enemies that do a big burst of your health down really quickly and then a slow damage over time. So you instantly feel like, oh my God, I'm nearly dead the moment they jump out at me. They're getting so paranoid. I'm going through this whole thing like, I gotta kill these fuckers. I'm just gonna kill them. I'm just gonna kill them. And basically I get to the end and I meet the Arachnite Queen, and the conversation that my character has with her makes me stare at the screen for like 5 minutes and realize, oh my God, I've been tricked into being a bigot. Like, I didn't understand who these people are, and I didn't understand the position they were in. And I've been told all these things about this culture that is not true. And I'm confronted with that now. And when I choose to let her go free, I felt like I had overcome a trial. And that decision there were good options on both sides, the pragmatism versus not, whether you think she's lying to you, any number of things. But that was one of the most powerful moments I've had as a person who loves classic theater and literature. That's one of my favorite experiences ever, because it is built around the moment of interaction, the choice, and how that choice is built up subtly and ahead of time. It's just a brilliant, brilliant moment that always sticks with me. And that's the key of interactive design, the idea of building to create a powerful choice for the person and the choice that matters.
And I think you answered my question, because what triggered my thinking about this word is I know that Netflix, even before they started their game division, they always had this like interactive division, and they call these experiences like Bandersnatch, like interactive media. And yes, there is a choice in there, but they never talked about why they chose to call it this way. But kind of what you just said, which was about being like living in a story, because when you're living in a story, you have choices versus when you're being told a story and you don't. So I found that kind of like tied the loose end in my brain. So that was good. Mm-hmm. Okay, next question for you is, it seems like you love game design. That's your passion. You've been doing it since you were in school and you studied it in school. Is there any high level changes, or like has game design evolved over the past, 5 to 10 years?
A lot of the tools have evolved, but largely the craft is the same. Like, we have a lot more powerful user-generated content tools to work with. We have more procedural generation. The landscape has shifted of what people are interested in. Mobile has risen hugely as becoming less an afterthought and more of a lot of the best gaming experiences are supposed to be mobile first, which is kind of how you have to do it because the control scheme is so different than PC. PC is very adaptable to mobile, but mobile's not very adaptable to PC because of those different screen sizes. There's a much larger focus on what that means and the different spread of how that ripples out to affect things. People used to think you could only build like brainless 5-minute games on mobile. And now people are realizing that some players play their games for 2 hours a day. So if that's the case, okay, like what else can we do with this? What's interesting to me is the craft of game design hasn't really changed as far as I can tell, because it's fundamentally the same type of thing. The tools and the environments, of course, change team to team, but that's much bigger than like the overall industry. The biggest industry-wide pushes and pulls are this big, well, of course, now we're talking about Web 3.0, which is this huge push and pull, but free-to-play and data-driven analysis has been the major theme of the last, and mobile focus and cross-platform play of the last X number of years. Trying to evolve and see what you can do with that and how you can create a sustainable monetization in a way that is rational and provable, but in a way that actually does produce like good results for players and for the games themselves. Because a lot of people have learned that it's very easy to measure the wrong things or to just measure the easy things. And it looks like the game is doing really well, then nobody plays it after a while because all these intangibles didn't get measured. Trying to marry that theme of how to, a phrase that's shown up a lot lately is data-informed design. Like, how do you use all the brilliant data we have available to us to make great data-informed decisions? And a lot of studios are either taking hard stances for or against, or trying to find clever ways to involve and work them together. That's always really, really fun. And I like having those conversations.
Going back once again to how, just like, I feel like words are important, data-informed decision-making, that concept I learned from Riot as well. And then after Riot, I work for big tech firms, and I thought it would be cool with that concept as well. But frankly, they're very data-driven. And if the data says one thing, the most senior executives will want to go that way. And I've worked on a couple of products, some gaming products actually, where we encountered what you said, which was like the high level metrics, the top line metrics and goals people understand, but it would drive something negative in the entire ecosystem. And then we're like, but wait a minute, we hit the goals, we hit the KPIs, but why isn't player sentiment or NPS a goal or like a sub goal? And those are going down, like falling off a cliff. So it's just fascinating. But I love the concept of data informed because we went from like industries not measuring any data or didn't have the tools to measure data.
Right.
Now they had it and they're like, okay, let's go 100%. And I think now the game industry, I think, is one of the first industries to really have access and a need to iterate on data.
Like, you can change very quickly with your game,
Exactly.
right, so speaking. And you can A/B test, you can do different things, different regions. It's so powerful and it's wonderful, but it's very easy to get ahead of our confidence. So for example, like, we've all, I'm sure, read Moneyball. I love that book. I've read it like 6 times. Basically, because I actually was going into business and I made a shift to game design because I just loved I love behavioral economics. I loved thinking about systems and emotion and motivation and how to build great teams. And ultimately, game design just sort of started filtering into it's just more fun version of that. So for me, at least. Now, the reason I bring up Moneyball is, if you look at the GM of the Houston Rockets, there's this great piece on him by Michael Lewis at the start of the Undoing Project. The article is actually available online. And basically, he talks about how he's basically doing Moneyball for basketball, and he's been wildly successful with it. But he says, we don't just blindly trust the model. If a kid breaks his leg before the amateur draft, that's not going to show up in the stats, and I want to know about it. And that's really important. If you look at a lot of the classic studies, you can see that people are really bad at self-reporting stuff. Like, there's studies where you've got people looking at pairs of jeans on the table and ask if they prefer the left or the right pair. Most people would choose one of them. They'd give the reasons for it. They talk, well, I like the color of this one a little bit better. I like the cut. It seems a bit more, the fabric's a bit smoother. Identical pairs of jeans. People preferred the ones next to their dominant hand. And basically, they were saying, though, to try to rationalize and justify that preference, that it was these other factors. So if you didn't know that this data could not be right, you would be assuming that the survey was accurate. I've seen art tests where basically people are shown 5 types of art and said which one would make you buy the game the most. And they would all say this one type, usually the most expensive or hyper-realistic version. And basically, it turns out, when you look at the click-throughs, what made them actually click on the thing in the first place, it's the stylized thing. It's a thing that stands out and pops. But then those people say they prefer this other art style that they didn't click on. And so it's really, really powerful, but you gotta have some skepticism. It's data science for a reason, not data faith.
Okay, kind of switching topics a bit. We talked a lot about, kind of like the fundamentals and frameworks of game design. Now, here's a hard question, or maybe an easy question. What does a great game designer look like? Like, when do you say, okay, that person is a great game designer?
Empathy. It's all about a sense of empathy for people who aren't you usually. You can be really great in a narrow field if you're just played every game in that field, you've got really good intuition, your player type happens to match with the audience, then you can be effective at that work. But I wouldn't usually consider that person a great game designer in the larger sense, more that they're a great player advocate for themselves who is also, able to come up with stuff that they like, that's a game designer, and that person can be like really, really good at what they do and very valuable to a team. So, but like the person I think of who just knocks my socks off is somebody who can look at something that looks like that's aimed at people completely different than them and see the value in it. When a game designer kind of goes off on Twitter or something about like, this game that people like is bad for obvious reason, and they're all wrong to like it. Like, I always feel this urge to take them aside and go, all right, look, buddy, if you have a theory about what makes a good game, and a lot of people like something that your theory says is bad, your theory is wrong. Like, that's just explicit results versus your theory. Like, it's wrong. You need to then ask yourself, why do they like it? Maybe my thing maybe I am pointing out a flaw, but maybe there's maybe in this particular context, the flaw isn't a flaw. A favorite example I like is if you look at like old school D&D, like the very first editions, like first edition Dungeons and Dragons, Chainmail, that kind of stuff. So many of the decisions are terrible by any modern game standard. Characters gain levels at different rates. Permadeath. You have 1 hit point, sometimes level 1. You just cast a spell once a day and your wizard is using a crossbow. Different classes and races max out at different levels. There's no way you gain XP through getting gold instead of actually fighting things. In fact, fighting things is a terrible idea. There's so many different bad decisions, but when you put them all together, it turns into a roguelike. It turns into this fun exploratory game where combat is so boring and so lethal that you should avoid it. And it creates this really clever play style about avoiding combat and finding clever ways to steal treasure, because that's how you get your experience points, to get treasure, and only getting into fights when you have this huge advantage. A random goblin terrifies you, and if you actually get strong enough, and the thing is your characters are dying so frequently, it doesn't matter that you can't control their character attributes. You had to roll your attributes randomly. You couldn't choose to play a wizard. You had to hope the dice would let you play a wizard. But they're all dying so quickly, it doesn't matter. And that means like all of us get to take turns being the level 5 person who's carrying the other guys. And so there's all this really cool stuff. And it created a really unique play culture that has created what's called the old school revival right now. That's really based off of just leaning into the adventures that revolved around these weird constraints that made it really fun. And so a lot of people just look at each of those individual design decisions, that's all terrible. But put it together and you look at the question of, okay, if we have this, how do we make this fun? It leads you in some really cool directions. So curiosity and empathy are the key to like good game design. Understanding why people like what they like, looking at a decision and seeing what it can do, being able to imagine and visualize how it ripples out into the game and affects the player experience, and just having a deep empathy for people that aren't you, because you have to design for a lot of them.
Okay, you just mentioned the phrase player advocate, which leads to my first kind of context setting, which was, I believe that there's lots of stuff happening in the world of Web3 games. Game designer seems to be kind of leading charge. I couldn't put my finger on the word, but it sounds like maybe the word's like being a player advocate, like to watch out for the player. Do you think that is the case? And then more broadly, I don't know if you have kind of like a macro view on Web3 games. I'll give you an example of like a macro view could be. A macro view could be something like we've taken a mechanism that's focused on maybe like rewarding creators and developers, but now we've made it the main decision for economy or something. I don't know. like any like high level thoughts on two things, two-part question. Why are game designers so vocal and critical today? And two, you know, what are your thoughts on the space? It's a very broad question, of course.
Now, just, I mean, this goes for the whole interview, but these are just always my opinions. They're not representative of Riot Games, yada, yada. But so the first part of the question is, why are so many game designers, you should say, some are super hyped about it. I have some friends who are super excited. But why are so many game designers often the ones who are like calling bullshit, I could say, on Web3 and NFTs? Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it is because a lot of things that it's sort of the game designer's job to sit at the nexus of technology and player experience. And so often when tech comes in that like is going to make our lives harder and try to figure out to adopt, and we have to it's our job to figure out what can we do with this tech. Like an engineer says, look, we've got this, we have to ask for tech and think, what do we need? What can help us do a thing to make our game better, to help players, or to make more money, or to, just enrich an event, that kind of thing. We have to think about, what do we want to ask for? How should we spend those resources? And it's not ultimately our call always, like it's, but we inform people whose call it is to say, look, if you give us this new tool, we can make this new cool boss, or this new cool event, or this new cool thing. And this is what we think is going to be really good for the game. On the other hand, sometimes people come to us and say, look, we made this thing, what can you do with it? And we have to think, okay, how can we take advantage of that? Doom and evolved out of this, with John Carmack just coming up with wizard engines, and then like John Romero and friends figuring out what to do with them. And that was like really cool. The issue with NFT is twofold. NFT specifically, but really Web3 in general. Let's focus on the NFT side first, because it's the easiest one to kind of explain in a vacuum, because metaverse is broader. But basically, the things people have said that NFTs are going to let us do are things that those people probably don't know have existed for decades. So it's really hard to someone says, for the first time, you're going to be able to trade your items that are like unique to you to another person. And there's going to be a number that says it's this unique thing. And I'm like, oh, like in Pokemon, when I traded my Charizard with trader ID 16783 to my friend through a Game Boy link cable, they're like, yeah, but somehow no different maybe. And we're like, you're going to have player-to-player economies. Like, and it's going to be amazing. Like, oh, the thing that almost killed Diablo 3, like the thing that they had to rip out of the game. And, on the other hand, the thing that was my favorite mini game in Guild Wars was the player-to-player economy. I'm actually a big fan of player-to-player economies, and there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with them. Warframe, it's done very well. There's a lot of great games that do it. But the point is, it's not new. It's been around for decades. Ultima Online was a thing. But most people who have only been, I was talking to some game designers recently, some really brilliant ones, veterans, and for 20, 30 years, who actually one of them, I think, was lead designer in Ultima Online. And basically, I was asked the same, why do people act like this is this new thing? And they were saying, you'd be surprised, Dan, how many people haven't studied the history of games. They just come in, they've only played free-to-play games in the modern genre. They've never played an MMO. Most of the big push in free-to-play, and this is something that I talk about a lot, has been about product managers wanting maximum control of the economy, not wanting to let you sell your account to somebody else. And so the idea that you could suddenly do that is really exciting. And I get that, but it exists. So when you say this new technology will allow us to do things we've never done before, but we've been doing it for decades, it's hard to trust you know what you're talking about, or you've done your due diligence. So a lot of people, game designers, just start blasting posts we see about that, because it comes off like a scam, or somebody who is enthusiastic but ignorant. If you say, if you buy my, I don't know, magical water, which is fortified with vitamin K, if you pour this on your plants, they will, these seeds, they will grow into plants. And we're like, yes, that's what water does. So that's where a lot of it comes from. And a lot of that gets spilled over to more interesting conversations about NFTs, because people just get this gut reaction of, this is all this hype train scam stuff. We need to kind of it creates a knee-jerk reaction, a very high level of suspicion that, and the anonymity of online comments can very quickly turn toxic. I try to avoid the toxicity parts. and talk more about like, all right, so my approach is always, if you want to get this to work, where are the landmines? Here, what is the history you need to know? What is the value you can deliver? It's not interesting to think of another way not to make a light bulb. It's very interesting to think of what are all the things you can do to make a light bulb. If you want to change the world, what do you got to do? Here's the stuff that would be useful for us. Rock it. I want to be shown all these great ideas on how Web 3.0 can change the world. I just haven't seen many yet myself.
And you know what's funny is because well, two things. One, I remember like recently one of your comments, someone was talking about like human capital, like NFTs where, you know, it's
Could
like
you pick a more topic?
Yeah, like a student who can you know, you get a percentage of his future earnings by investing in his like DAO or something. And you're like, you know, weren't poker players doing this like in the past? And I think because it's so hyped, I think some people legitimately just don't know the history. And some people, either they know, they just don't care because it's a way to consult in space. It's a way to kind of like make a quick buck if they can. So I like that part. The second part, which I found interesting, is we just had a really good games product manager on this podcast. And I asked him, what do you think, what would you call your craft? And he said, my craft is to make the game money. So, and he focused on free to play. And so I kind of like your comment about product managers thinking about kind of like maximize control over the economy, because it aligns with everything this other guest said, because he was all about like, yeah, here are like the max, like all these different ways to make money, but he actually was pro NFTs too. So that was kind of interesting. But on the topic about, you know, product managers, game designers, once again, this could be more of like it depends on the team situation, but how are these game design decisions made? Is it, you know, a committee? Is it the producer,
Totally
product manager? Who decides? And I mean, it's a very general question, right? So maybe it's like, it depends on the team.
It depends on the team. Like there's no way around it. At different studios, there's a different role usually that is considered king. Not always, sometimes it's much more egalitarian, but usually at the end of the day, you got a lot of people at the same level of seniority. They're disagreeing. Who makes the call? Either it's going to be a director figure, or it's going to be, but often that person's going to take a cue from multiple discipline leaders who are advocating very independently. And that person will usually like either default to one, or the culture will just heavily do it. Like for example, at Blizzard, I was really weirded out sometimes about how much authority was given to designers. And when I remember like being asked like, hey, so here's some ideas for audio, which should we do? And I'm saying, well, I'll tell you my goals, but you're the audio veteran with 20 years of experience. Maybe you should figure out the best way to execute on the goals. And he's like, wow, you're great at collaboration. And I'm like, that's the bar? And like, it's very important if you are at a studio where your role is sort of elevated to be the person that people are supposed to defer to, that you don't advocate really strongly for things, that you listen and use that to kind of enforce the Magna Carta. So basically, you want to have a very collaborative development. If something is really strongly in the area of a discipline owner, you want to trust that discipline owner. If something is really in the area of another one, you want them to trust you. But like, for example, Blizzard is very, or at least the past was, at the team I was on, was very much like a lot of authority given to designers over even people that are much more senior in their craft. The designer was the ultimate sort of vision holder of how things came together. At EA, it was much more producer driven. Producers are more in charge. At Zynga, I hear product managers are really the people who drive it, a lot of mobile studios. And so like, it really depends on the team about like which discipline do ultimately the true holders of power trust the most and want to empower the most. And how you make that decision shapes a lot of culture and shapes a lot about what your team values. Yeah, it's a hard thing to make, but it's really about, but I think that it's healthiest if you're going to work, if you're working on your own studio. It's better, generally speaking, if someone's really passionate about something and they're in charge of executing on it, and you think that maybe their idea isn't as good as yours, but it's not going to break anything, tell them, you know, that you're how you feel, and then say, but you're in charge of this and I trust you. And they will execute at 110%. And the thing is, if you kind of force them to the other way that you think is better, maybe your idea might be 15% better. Sometimes you're wrong. especially if it's in a discipline craft, you're often wrong. But if they execute it like 80% enthusiasm on somebody else's idea, if they hit into a wall, often they're not going to work as hard to find a way around that wall, because they'll be like, yeah, I told you it was a bad idea. And that's really hard to fix. And on the other hand, they're going to want to like argue more with you about your ideas, even with your expertise, because you did that with them, and that's going to create a bit of reciprocity, which is you're not going to appreciate it when you're on the receiving end. And the other piece about it is, like, if on the other hand you say you trust them to do their idea, they will often either come back a week later and say, I explored some more, I think you're right, and that ownership will be very valuable for them. They know that you've trusted them. On the other hand, they'll just execute 110%. It's going to turn out better most of the time. So that's generally how I try to, even in areas where I am given a lot of authority, make decisions. Just trust people who are in charge of the discipline. As long as I don't think it's going to just break anything, it usually works out so much better.
Last question for me is, for this audience, we've recognized that a craft usually is something you could perfect over an entire career, over a lifetime. But we do live in this world where people want to test new things out, people have second careers and things like that. Any recommendations on how people can, just like test or flirt with some, game design tasks themselves? You mentioned board games earlier, which I thought was a cool idea because that's kind of like fast. Is there anything else you could recommend people can do if they're just like, hey, like, how would you know you would be a good game designer or not? Like, like how would you know? Like, is there something you can like try? Is there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely, I would say there's very different types of game designers and who specialize in different things. But the main thing I would always recommend is take a board game that you don't like that much, try to change rules to make it better. That's a really great way to test out system design. Just grab it, you don't like Risk, great, make it better. Play with that, just try changing some rules, try adding some stuff, try removing something to make it better. If you can take a game and figure out a rule you can remove to make it better, or a system you can remove, that means you're probably a really good game designer. Anyone can make something better by adding things. If you can remove things, it's really powerful. The other way I would say to test that out, which is great, is just look into modding. Like, frankly, building levels in Super Mario Maker, great way to see if you're interested in level design. And if you don't know what makes a good level or not, ask yourself that question. Another great thing that I like to do is, modding and that's good, and sort of level creation is good. You try Roblox out, use existing creators. Dreams, another good one. But honestly, I would just say, look at user-generated content and tools, really good idea. But also just watch some game design talks. There's a lot of really good GDC talks out there. The best one in the world, in my opinion, is, and it was only recently released from the vault to public on YouTube, is George Fan's How I Got My Mom to Play Through Plants vs. Zombies. It is, I think, many people I know independently just call this the best game design talk ever, and I think they're right. If you watch that talk and it's interesting to you, it's a good sign that you like game design problems. This is ultimately all about how he took a hardcore genre of tower defense strategy and made it something that his mother could play through a series of subtle design decisions. Watch random YouTube videos about like game designer's toolkit, how to, do the games that design themselves, just random stuff like that. If you find that interesting, you might like game design, and just give it a shot.
Awesome. I'll ask, I found that video. I will also add it to the show notes. So Dan, this is a very interesting conversation, and thanks for your time today.
Sure, my pleasure.